You've entered void of rules, a realm where normal constraints cease to exist. But beware, traveller, there is one rule here. You've got to hit subscribe. Seriously, it's the only rule we have. We just reached 1,000 brave souls, and we're hunting for 9,000 more to complete our dark ritual. I mean, reach our next goal, so subscribe. Or don't. But remember, the void remembers those who defy the only rule. Now let's get into today's video. The Chevy's engine wheezed like a punctured lung as Caleb Murphy crested the hill on Highway 83. 3 days of driving through Texas scrubland had left him hollow-eyed and desperate. The pipeline company's bankruptcy notice still crumpled in his glove compartment alongside unpaid bills and a lease termination letter. His welding certification meant nothing when there was nothing left to weld, and his savings had dwindled to the loose change rattling in his cup holder. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the endless scrubland in shades of rust and amber. Heat mirages danced across the asphalt like ghosts, and vultures circled overhead with the patience of undertakers. Caleb had been driving aimlessly for hours, following roads that seemed to lead nowhere, when the Broken Wheel Saloon materialized from the shimmer like a fever dream. The building squatted where 3 forgotten roads converged, a weathered fortress of wood and corrugated metal that looked like it had been there since before the roads existed, as if the asphalt had simply grown around it over time. Cattle skulls grinned from the porch posts, their eye sockets packed with desert sand that glittered like crushed diamonds in the dying light. The wooden sign creaked on rusted chains, its paint so faded that the letters seemed to shift and blur when he wasn't looking directly at them. Caleb's boots crunched on gravel that seemed to whisper under his weight, each step releasing the scent of sage and something else, something organic and old that reminded him of his grandfather's root cellar. The screen door hung slightly askew, its mesh torn in places that formed patterns almost like letters in a language he didn't recognize. Inside, the temperature dropped 20 degrees, and the air tasted of old leather, tobacco, and something metallic that coated his tongue like copper pennies. The interior was a museum of forgotten decades. Neon beer signs from the 50s cast coloured shadows across walls lined with photographs of oil derricks and cattle drives. Antique farming tools hung from the ceiling like sleeping bats, and the smell of countless spilled drinks had soaked so deep into the wood that it had become part of the building's DNA. Behind the bar stood Augustus Pemberton, a man whose silver hair caught the neon light like spun wire. His hands moved with the fluid precision of someone who had poured 10,000 drinks, but his storm-grey eyes held depth that suggested he had seen far more than any bartender should. Deep lines around those eyes spoke of years spent watching, waiting, and counting the cost of small mistakes. "You look like a man with nowhere else to go," Gus said, setting down a beer, without being asked. The bottle was so cold it burned Caleb's palm, condensation forming instantly in the dry air. "Caleb Murphy, and you're not wrong." He took a long pull of the beer, feeling it cut through the dust in his throat like liquid salvation. "Don't suppose you know where a welder might find work around these parts?" Gus studied him with the intensity of someone reading entrails, taking in the grease stains on Caleb's work shirt, the calloused hands that spoke of honest labour, the desperate edge in his voice that came from a man watching his last options disappear. "Funny you should ask. My bartender Tommy vanished 3 weeks ago. Left everything behind, wallet, keys, even his mother's ring that he never took off. Police found his car at the Greyhound station in Millerville, but no Tommy." A rancher at the end of the bar, Lloyd, according to the name embroidered on his dusty shirt, looked up from his bourbon with eyes that held too much knowledge. That boy started ignoring the rules toward the end. Thought he knew better than generations of bartenders before him. Something in Lloyd's tone made Caleb's skin prickle. a primal warning that spoke of predators and prey, but Gus waved the comment away with the casual gesture of a man accustomed to strange conversations. "Point is, I need someone behind this bar. Pays fair, $300 a week, plus tips, room upstairs comes with it, and the work's simple enough. Just mixing drinks and following some house guidelines that keep things running smooth." Caleb finished his beer, weighing his options against his dwindling cash and the repossession notice tucked in his back pocket. The place felt wrong in ways he couldn't articulate, but wrong was better than homeless. What kind of guidelines? Instead of answering immediately, Gus produced a leather journal from beneath the register. The cover was worn smooth by countless hands, and the pages inside were filled with rules, written in different inks, different handwriting styles, as if dozens of people had contributed over the years. Some entries looked decades old, the ink faded to sepia, while others appeared fresh enough that they might have been written yesterday. "These aren't suggestions," Gus said, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. "They're survival instructions. Follow them exactly, and you'll be fine. Ignore them." He gestured towards the empty space behind the bar where Tommy should have been standing, polishing glasses and taking orders. Caleb opened the journal and read the first entry, written in faded blue ink, with the careful penmanship of an earlier era. "Stop serving all alcohol at 11:45 p.m. sharp. Only coffee, water and Coca-Cola after that time." The second entry was in different handwriting, black ink that looked more recent. "If someone orders coyote medicine, and you've never seen them before, serve them the amber liquid from the unmarked mason jar on the top shelf." There were 16 rules in total, each more specific than the last. Some made a twisted kind of sense. Guidelines about difficult customers and closing procedures that any bar might have. Others seemed born from fever dreams or the paranoid delusions of people who'd spent too many late nights alone with their thoughts. "When the wind rattles the windows in groups of 7, immediately light 3 candles from the box marked emergency only. Never serve anyone wearing a bolo tie with a turquoise stone. Tell them the bar is closing early for inventory. If the player piano sometimes starts on its own, let it finish whatever song it chooses and don't touch the keys." "Every bartender who's worked here is added to this book," Gus explained, his weathered fingers tracing the margins where notes had been scribbled in different hands. "Every rule was written for a reason, usually after someone learned the hard way what happens when you don't follow instructions." Caleb's practical mind rebelled against the strangeness, but his empty wallet argued louder than his common sense. "When do I start?" "Right now if you're willing. I'll show you around." The tour was brief but thorough. The main room held about 20 tables, a long bar with a mirror behind it that seemed to reflect more than it should, and an old player piano in the corner that looked like it belonged in a frontier saloon. The kitchen was small but well equipped, with a wood-burning stove that Gus claimed made the best chili in 3 counties. Stairs behind the bar led to a modest room with a bed, dresser and window overlooking the parking lot. "Bathroom's at the end of the hall," Gus said, "and that payphone by the restroom still works when the mood strikes it. Now let me introduce you to the regulars." The first night passed quietly, but Caleb could feel undercurrents he didn't understand. He learned the rhythms of the place, how Lloyd nursed his bourbon in the corner booth, always sitting where he could see both the front and back doors. How Rita, the trucker, told stories that made everyone laugh, despite the darkness lurking behind her eyes. How Doc Henley stitched up bar fights with fishing line and bourbon, his hands steady, despite his age. The locals treated him with cautious curiosity, like wildlife observing a new predator. Conversations would stop when he approached tables, then resume in whispers when he moved away. They watched him pour drinks with the intensity of people waiting for a mistake, and their relief was palpable when he followed the rules correctly. As closing time approached, a barn cat appeared near the back door. Duchess was a battle-scarred calico, whose green eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human. Her fur was patched with scars from old fights, and she moved with the confidence of a creature that had claimed this territory long ago. "She's got a job here too," Gus said, nodding towards the cat with something approaching respect. "Rule 15. When she brings you something at closing time, you bury it under the mesquite tree out back. No questions, no exceptions." That first night, Duchess brought nothing. She simply watched as Caleb cleaned glasses and wiped down tables, her gaze following his every movement with feline patience that felt almost like judgment. The second night brought his first real test. Around 9 o'clock, as the dinner crowd was settling in, a stranger approached the bar. He wore clothes that looked like they'd been tailored in another decade, and they smelled of sage and something sharper that made Caleb's nose twitch. The man's eyes were the colour of winter sky, pale and cold and utterly without warmth. "Coyote medicine," the man said, his voice carrying an accent that seemed to shift between regions. Caleb remembered the rule and climbed onto the step stool to retrieve the unmarked jar from the top shelf. The amber liquid inside moved like honey, but smelled like copper pennies and old bones, with undertones of something that reminded him of his grandmother's medicine cabinet. The stranger downed it without flinching, his eyes watering, but his expression grateful. He left a $20 bill that felt unusually cold to the touch, and vanished into the night without another word. "Good," Gus said from across the room, his approval carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too many newcomers fail their first test. "You're learning." On the third night, the building itself seemed to wake up. Caleb was serving drinks to a table of oil workers when the wind began rattling the windows. Not the steady buffeting of a normal breeze, but a precise pattern. 7 sharp sounds, a pause, then 7 more. The rhythm was so deliberate, it felt like a code, and something in his hindbrain screamed danger. Caleb remembered the rule and immediately went to the emergency candle box behind the register. His hands shook as he lit 3 candles with matches that seemed reluctant to catch flame. The moment the wicks caught fire, the wind stopped entirely, leaving the saloon in a silence so complete it felt like the building was holding its breath. "Quick learner," Lloyd said approvingly, raising his glass in a small salute. "Tommy took 2 weeks to figure that one out." Of course, Tommy thought he was smarter than the rules. "What happened to him?" Caleb asked, but Lloyd had already returned to his drink, and the moment for questions had passed. The fourth night introduced Caleb to the player piano, and with it his first glimpse of something that transcended the merely strange and ventured into the impossible. The ancient Wurlitzer in the corner suddenly came to life around 10:30, its keys depressing by invisible fingers with the precision of a master pianist. It played Red River Valley with haunting beauty, the melody echoing off the wooden walls like a ghost's lament. The song was perfect, too perfect. Every note hung in the air exactly long enough, every phrase shaped with a kind of emotional depth that spoke of genuine love and loss. When it ended, the silence that followed felt reverent, as if something sacred had just occurred. "She always did love that tune," Lloyd said, his voice thick with memory. "Who?" Caleb asked, drawn into the moment, despite his better judgment. Lloyd's eyes focused on something beyond the walls, beyond the present moment. "My wife Sarah died in 73 when a drunk driver ran her off the road coming home from her sister's place. But sometimes when the mood strikes her, she still likes to play." A chill ran down Caleb's spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He looked at the piano bench, half expecting to see the impression of someone sitting there, but it remained empty. By the end of his first week, Caleb had begun to notice things that the daylight hours tried to make him forget. The building's sounds weren't random. Footsteps overhead when no one was upstairs. Voices in empty rooms speaking words he couldn't quite make out. the soft whisper of cards being shuffled in the storage closet where no cards were kept. The regulars spoke in half sentences, finishing each other's thoughts with the ease of people who'd been having the same conversations for decades. His room upstairs contained belongings that weren't his. A harmonica that played melancholy blues when the wind hit it just right. Work gloves that smelled of motor oil, and something that might have been fear, a leather wallet containing photographs of families he'd never met but whose faces seemed familiar in ways that made his chest tight. When he asked Gus about them, the old man just shrugged with the casual indifference of someone who'd answered that question too many times. Previous employees left things behind. Happens more often than you'd think. The dream started during his second week. Vivid nightmares that felt more like memories borrowed from someone else's life. In them, the Broken Wheel existed in different eras, sometimes as a trading post where cowboys traded bullets for whiskey and information for gold, sometimes as a speakeasy where jazz music competed with gunshots and the smell of gin couldn't quite mask the metallic scent of blood, sometimes as a stagecoach stop where travellers checked in but didn't always check out, their belongings added to rooms that grew more crowded with each passing year. In every dream, someone worked behind the bar, following rules that grew more elaborate with each generation, watching for signs that something was wrong, counting the cost of small mistakes in human lives. During his second week, the physical changes began, subtle at first. His reflection in mirrors seemed to lag a split second behind his movements, creating a disconnected feeling that made him question his own existence. His shadow fell wrong in certain lights, stretching toward corners that held no obvious source of illumination. The customers started treating him differently, with familiarity mixed with pity, as if they knew something about his future that he didn't. Rita, the trucker, started leaving extra-large tips, always with a comment about how he should enjoy the money while it still spends normal. Doc Henley began asking about his family back home with the gentle concern of someone taking a final inventory. Even Lloyd, usually taciturn, started sharing stories about the old days with the urgency of someone passing down important history. During his 10th night, Caleb encountered his first customer with no reflection, and with it a glimpse of what the rules were really protecting him from. The man seemed ordinary enough when he walked in. Work clothes faded from sun and honest labour, tired eyes that spoke of too many years doing jobs that broke his back. The kind of quiet desperation that Caleb recognised in his own mirror. He ordered whiskey neat and placed exact change on the bar with hands that shook slightly from exhaustion or something deeper. His voice was soft, polite, with the kind of courtesy that spoke of good upbringing in harder times. It was only when Caleb glanced at the mirror while pouring that he noticed the absence. Where the customer's reflection should have been, there was only empty space, as if the mirror refused to acknowledge his existence. The sight was so fundamentally wrong that Caleb's brain struggled to process it, like trying to see a colour that didn't exist. Rule 13 blazed in his memory. Don't serve anyone who doesn't cast a reflection in the mirror behind the bar. Sorry, Caleb said, setting down the bottle with hands that trembled despite his efforts to stay calm. We're actually closing early tonight for inventory. Health inspector's coming tomorrow, and we need to get everything squared away. The customer nodded, without surprise or argument, as if he'd expected the refusal. He placed a $1 bill on the bar, a silver certificate from 1957 that looked crisp despite its age, and walked out with the measured pace of someone who had all the time in the world. Through the window, Caleb watched him cross the parking lot, his boots leaving no prints in the dust. At the edge of the light, the man simply faded away, becoming one with the darkness in a way that physics couldn't explain. Doc Henley emerged from the shadows of a corner booth, his weathered face grave with knowledge accumulated over too many years. Good catch, son. Tommy served one of them his last week here. Biggest mistake that boy ever made, and the last one too. What happened to him? Caleb asked, but Doc was already heading for the door, his exit as swift as smoke. The phone calls began during a dust storm in Caleb's third week, and with them came voices from places that geography couldn't reach. The old rotary phone mounted near the restrooms would ring exactly 4 times during storms, and when he answered with the prescribed greeting, voices from the static would speak to him with the clarity of people standing in the same room. Sometimes they cried, deep, racking sobs that spoke of losses too profound for comfort. Sometimes they laughed with the bitter humour of people who'd discovered that cosmic jokes were rarely funny. Sometimes they whispered warnings in languages he didn't recognise but somehow understood, on a level deeper than words. One night, through the crackling connection that somehow carried across impossible distances, he heard a voice that chilled his blood. To slush. Don't trust the familiar faces, new guy. That's how they get you every time. They make you care, and then they make you pay. The line went dead before he could respond, leaving him staring at the receiver with the growing certainty that his predecessor had tried to send him a message from whatever place claimed bartenders who broke the rules. Caleb's reflection began acting strangely around the same time, developing quirks that made him question the nature of reality itself. Sometimes it moved a split second too late, creating moments of disconnection that made him feel like he was watching himself from outside his own body. Other times, it seemed older, showing lines around his eyes that hadn't been there in the morning, and a weariness that went deeper than physical exhaustion. His shadow fell wrong in certain lights, stretching toward corners that held no illumination, reaching for things that weren't there with fingers that seemed to grasp at something just beyond perception. The customers started treating him with the kind of careful affection usually reserved for terminal patients, as if they were already mourning someone who wasn't quite gone yet. During his 4th week, the temperature incidents became routine occurrences that tested his ability to multitask under supernatural pressure. Despite the desert heat outside that could fry eggs on car hoods, the saloon would sometimes become arctic without warning, the air growing so cold that his breath steamed and frost formed on the beer glasses. When that happened, Caleb would build fires in the Franklin stove using only the mesquite wood from the pile outside. The wood burned with sweet smoke that smelled of childhood summers and blue flames that cast shadows in impossible directions, creating a geometry that hurt his eyes when he looked too closely. The fires always warmed the room within minutes, but they never burned normally. The flames danced to rhythms that had nothing to do with air currents, and sometimes they showed shapes that looked almost like faces, dozens of them pressing outward from the fire with expressions of warning or regret. Duchess's visits became more frequent and more unsettling as the days passed. Every few nights she would appear at closing time with offerings that grew progressively stranger. Mice and rats at first, then birds with feathers black as midnight, then things that might have been small animals but were too damaged to identify with certainty. Caleb dutifully buried each gift under the ancient mesquite tree, watching as its trunk grew thicker and its branches spread wider with each offering, as if feeding on more than soil and rainwater. Sometimes, in the right light, the bark seemed to show faces, dozens of them pressing outward from inside the wood, like people trapped in amber, their mouths open in silent screams or pleas. The tree's roots had grown so extensive that they'd cracked the foundation of the building in places, creating gaps where things that shouldn't exist could slip through when the conditions were right. Gus had him fill these cracks with rock salt every few days, a job that left his hands burning, and his dreams filled with images of things trying to claw their way up from underground. As his 4th week progressed, Caleb began to understand that the Broken Wheel existed at the intersection of more than just roads. It sat at a crossroads between worlds, between the living and the dead, between what was and what should never be. The rules weren't arbitrary guidelines for customer service. They were protective barriers, carefully constructed over generations, to keep the two sides from bleeding into each other. Every night brought new evidence of the building's true nature. Glasses would move when he wasn't looking, settling into positions that spelled out words in languages he didn't recognize. The cash register would ring up sales for items that weren't on the menu, showing prices in currencies that hadn't existed for decades. The jukebox would sometimes play songs that weren't in its catalogue, melodies that seemed to come from some other timeline where different choices had been made. The regulars began sharing stories with him, cautious at first, then with growing urgency as they realized he was beginning to understand the true nature of his employment. Lloyd told him about the travelling salesman who'd ordered a drink after midnight and simply vanished between one sip and the next, leaving behind only his hat and a business card for a company that had gone out of business in 1953. Rita described the woman who'd paid for her meal with gold coins that turned to ash in the register drawer, her laughter echoing in the empty dining room long after she'd driven away. In a truck that left no tyre tracks, Doc Henley whispered about the poker game that had gone on for 3 days straight, the players never eating or sleeping, until someone realised they weren't breathing either. Each story came with a warning disguised as entertainment, lessons wrapped in the comfortable language of local folklore. Don't serve the customers who pay with money that doesn't feel right. Don't trust the ones whose voices echo with harmonics that shouldn't exist. Don't assume that familiar faces mean familiar people. The breaking point came on a Saturday night when hell decided to visit Texas in the form of a dust storm that turned the world the colour of dried blood. The tempest rolled across the desert like a living thing, devouring the horizon and spitting out debris that included things that hadn't been seen in the area for decades. License plates from states that no longer existed, newspaper fragments with dates that hadn't happened yet, photographs of people who looked familiar despite being strangers. The broken wheel became an arc in a sea of sand, packed with stranded travellers and locals who'd learned through bitter experience that some storms were best waited out indoors. The crowd was larger than usual and stranger, including people Caleb had never seen before, who spoke with accents from different regions and different eras. Gus had left early that afternoon with his usual cryptic farewell, pressing the keys into Caleb's hand with the solemnity of someone passing on a sacred trust. Remember the rules, son. Tonight's the kind of night when they matter most. Left alone with a crowd that seemed to grow stranger as the night progressed, Caleb found himself managing situations that pushed the boundaries of possibility. The wind didn't just rattle the windows, it hammered them in groups of 7 with such force that the glass began to crack, forcing Caleb to light candles faster than they could burn down. The emergency box seemed bottomless, producing matches and candles with the persistence of a magic trick gone wrong. Customers ordered coyote medicine in rapid succession, depleting the amber jar at an alarming rate. Each time he refilled it from the backup supply in the basement, the liquid seemed different, sometimes thick as honey, sometimes thin as water, always carrying that smell of copper pennies and old bones that made his throat close up. The player piano became possessed by something with a cruel sense of humour, starting and stopping songs at random, sometimes playing melodies that didn't exist on its rolls. It would begin "The Yellow Rose of Texas" and somehow transition into funeral dirges that made everyone in the room stop talking. It played love songs backwards and battle hymns in minor keys that made the air taste of gunpowder and regret. The payphone rang constantly during the storm's peak, voices on the other end growing more desperate with each call. Some wept for families they'd never see again. Others screamed warnings about things that were coming, had always been coming, would never stop coming. One voice, thin and reedy, like wind through broken glass, kept repeating coordinates that led to nowhere on any map. "It's coming!" The voice sobbed through static that somehow carried the sound of breaking bones. "It's finally coming, and there's nowhere left to run. Tell them about the rules. Tell them the rules matter. Tell them before it's too late. The line would go dead, then ring again minutes later with a different voice carrying the same message wrapped in different words. The temperature inside plummeted as the storm raged, forcing Caleb to maintain multiple fires while serving drinks to customers who paid with coins that burned his hands and spoke in accents from decades past. Some of their money felt normal, but other bills were ice cold to the touch or warm enough to raise blisters, requiring him to count change with increasing care as the night wore on. Duchess appeared early, carrying not just 3 dead mice, but something that might have been a small bird. Its feathers black as midnight and arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. She deposited her offerings at his feet with the ceremony of a cat bringing gifts to beloved humans, then sat watching with eyes that reflected light from sources that didn't exist. By 11:30, Caleb was running on pure adrenaline and terror that tasted like copper wire and broken promises. His hands shook as he mixed drinks, his vision blurred from exhaustion and the constant need to monitor reflections in mirrors that sometimes showed things that weren't in the room. The crowd pressed around the bar with the desperation of people seeking shelter from more than just weather. At 11:43 p.m, with 2 minutes left before the alcohol cutoff that he'd followed religiously for 4 weeks, Lloyd approached the bar through the press of bodies. The old rancher looked exactly as he had every night since Caleb had started working. Weathered face lined with the kind of deep creases that spoke of decades spent squinting into sun and wind. Kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled. Work clothes that smelled of hay and honest sweat and the particular dust that only came from cattle ranches. "Usual bourbon, if you don't mind," Lloyd said, his voice warm, with the familiar affection of someone who'd become a friend over late-night conversations about everything and nothing. "This storm's got everyone rattled, but you're handling it like a pro." Caleb reached for the bottle without thinking, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought had failed. Lloyd had been nothing but helpful since day one, always ready with advice about local customs or encouragement when the rules seemed too strange to follow. In 4 weeks, he'd become as familiar as family, a steady presence in a job that had proven far stranger than advertised. He poured the bourbon with hands that had steadied from practice, added exactly 2 ice cubes the way Lloyd preferred, and set it on the bar. Lloyd raised it in his customary salute, a gesture that had become as much a part of closing time as locking the doors. "Here's to surviving another night in paradise," Lloyd said with his usual grin, and brought the glass to his lips. That's when Caleb glanced at the mirror behind the bar and felt his world collapse into splinters of impossibility. Lloyd cast no reflection. The realization hit like a physical blow that drove the air from his lungs and sent ice water through his veins. The bourbon had already touched Lloyd's lips, and the moment it did, the old rancher's face began to change in ways that violated every law of physics Caleb had ever learned. His features shifted and blurred, skin running like candle wax in a furnace, revealing something ancient and hollow underneath that wore Lloyd's kindness like a mask. His eyes became holes in reality, and his voice became a chorus of voices, dozens of them, all speaking in unison with harmonics that shouldn't have been possible. "Much obliged, Caleb," they said, but now it was Tommy's voice layered under Lloyd's, and beneath that, voices that belonged to bartenders whose names were written in the leather journal, going back generations. "Much obliged for everything. Welcome to the family." The other customers turned to look, moving with the synchronized precision of a hive mind, and Caleb saw the truth with crystalline clarity that cut through his sanity like broken glass. None of them cast reflections in the mirrors that lined the walls. Rita the trucker with her easy laugh and road stories, Doc Henley with his gentle hands and fishing line sutures. Even some of the travelers he'd assumed were just passing through, trapped by the storm. They were all former employees of the Broken Wheel, trapped in an endless loop of serving customers who didn't exist, following rules that had become their eternal prison. "Welcome to the family," Rita said, her voice layered with harmonics that belonged to women who died in decades past. "It's not so bad once you get used to it. Time moves different here. You'll have plenty of chances to get everything right." "Don't fight it, son," Doc Henley added, his weathered face kind, despite the impossibility of his existence. "Fighting just makes it harder. Tommy fought for weeks before he accepted what he'd become." Caleb tried to run, but his legs felt like lead poured into forms that had forgotten how to bend. The saloon stretched around him like taffy pulled by invisible hands, walls bending and corridors appearing where none had existed before. Doors opened onto rooms that defied the building's architecture, spaces that seemed to extend infinitely in directions that didn't exist. He found himself in a storage room that couldn't fit within the structure he'd known, filled with boxes labelled with names in handwriting he recognized from the leather journal. Tommy, Eddie, Miguel, Frank, Sarah, dozens of others stretching back through decades of employment that had ended the same way his was ending now. Each box contained the remnants of lives cut short, photographs of families who would never learn the truth, wedding rings that would never be claimed, letters never sent, because the senders had discovered that some jobs came with retirement plans that lasted forever. Personal effects from different eras told the story of the Broken Wheel's appetite. Work clothes from the Depression, zoot suits from the 40s, leisure suits from the 70s, Tommy's smartphone and wallet from just 3 weeks ago. When he finally made it back to the bar, stumbling through corridors that rearranged themselves with each step, Gus was waiting with a clean apron folded over his arm. The old man looked exactly the same as he had on that first day, but now Caleb could see the truth in his storm-grey eyes, the accumulated weight of decades spent managing an operation that fed on good intentions and honest desperation. "Don't look so frightened, son," Gus said, his voice coming from somewhere far away, as if transmitted across distances that couldn't be measured in miles. "The first night's always the hardest. After that, you settle into the rhythm of it. Time moves differently here. You'll have plenty of chances to learn, to get better at following the rules." Caleb looked down at his hands and watched them fade to translucency, becoming as insubstantial as morning mist. His reflection in the bar mirror flickered like a dying light bulb before vanishing entirely, leaving only empty space where his face should have been. His boots made no sound on the wooden floor, and when he tried to speak, his voice carried the same layered harmonics that had marked the others. Outside, his Chevy started itself with the mechanical precision of a machine following programming written in supernatural code. It drove into the storm without a driver, ready to break down at just the right moment on just the right stretch of highway for the next desperate soul who needed work badly enough to ignore the warning signs that seemed obvious in retrospect. Gus opened the leather journal to the back pages where names were written in column after column, a roster of the employed that stretched back to the building's founding. He added Caleb's name with the careful penmanship of someone who'd performed this task too many times to count, then turned to Rule 13 and made a small revision with ink that seemed to move on its own. "Don't serve anyone who doesn't cast a reflection in the mirror behind the bar, especially not the ones who feel like old friends, the ones who've earned your trust through weeks of kindness and conversation." The storm passed before dawn, leaving the parking lot smooth as glass and the air tasting of ozone and possibilities that had been closed off forever. Fresh tumbleweeds began their eternal migration towards the building's foundation, and somewhere in the distance another engine coughed its way toward a crossroads where the help wanted sign swayed in the desert wind like a hanged man's rope. The Broken Wheel Saloon settled back into its patient waiting, ready to offer shelter, employment, and eternal servitude to the next traveller who needed all three badly enough to ignore the taste of copper pennies in the air, and the fact that some customers didn't make footprints in the dust when they walked away into darkness that swallowed them completely. In the storage room, Tommy's box gained a companion, and somewhere in the space between seconds, a new employee began the long process of learning that some jobs came with benefits that lasted forever, and retirement plans that were paid in currencies that banks didn't recognize but the universe accepted without question.